and welcome to the second episode of Widdecombe, Webb and Woberts. I'm Emma Webb and I'm here with the former Shadow Home Secretary and Brexit Party MEP Anne Widdecombe and comedian Abi Roberts. And throughout the show, you can send us your questions through the live stream or via Twitter using the hashtag NCFWWW, or you can send us an email via contact@newcultureforum.org.uk. Since our last show, there have been, to say the least, a lot of developments, particularly on the vaccine front. So I think that is where we will begin with this article in The Spectator by Ross Clark, who I mentioned in the last episode, had written this interesting article in The Telegraph about the potential for vaccine passports to become some kind of broader electronic ID, has now written in The Spectator about the government's moves towards transforming vaccine passports into some kind of overall health passport that would do things like record your fruit and veg intake, the amount of exercise that you do, and to give you credit, like this Chinese social credit system, to reward you for good behaviour and presumably to penalise you for bad behaviour as well. And he was talking about the potential of this to affect people's, access to everyday life. So I thought, given that we were fighting about this last time round, that we should bring this one up again. So Anne, if you would like to begin by savaging.
First of all, there is no law on earth which compels you to download an app. Absolutely none. You don't have to prove your vaccination status via app. You can do it, as I've done it, through letter. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Secondly, I don't quite get this. So you're going to be rewarded if you buy some fruit and veg. What happens if you then go next door and buy a great sticky bun? Who's going to know about that? Oh no, are we going to have CCTV cameras linked up to the
cashless society? They can see when you buy that sticky bun.
As I said last week, I think there is a fine line between seeing an encroachment of liberty and just getting into conspiracy theories. So, if the government wants to monitor my intake of veg, it's going to have an exceptionally hard job to do it because I simply won't download the app. What's so difficult about that?
But I think the fact that we are even discussing this, I think a few months ago I said, sort of jokingly on Twitter, oh, what next? Are we going to be told off what we eat? And everyone went, oh, you're mad. What a surprise. The thing is, once an app, we won't have the app because we're sensible, rational people, but many people will just go, well, it's what the government wants. And then, of course, the next thing you know, they're tracking what you eat, who you sleep with, your medical history. Oh no, I've started early this time, scandalising Anne. But then, and also, couldn't you just strap your phone to your dog and then get it just to run at a great distance? And
This was a point that Ross Clark made in this Spectator article, is that they're already trying to look at ways to stop you from being able to send your phone on a jog with a friend while you chow down on a pizza.
Exactly, where you stuff your face.
But I think the concern is that we've seen this with, because you say that this wouldn't be an issue if, like with the NHS app, people are just offloading it now to get around the issue of the pingdemic.
People are being pinged constantly. Are coming off it.
But there are signs that there will be circumstances in which, yes, now it's not mandatory to have the app, but it could be. So, for example, we've seen with care home staff that vaccinations have become mandatory. There are discussions underway that were announced this week that Boris Johnson is apparently discussing making vaccine passports mandatory for students, or vaccines mandatory for students, but it will be done through vaccine passports. So and also we've seen it with discussions about the Premier League, whether unvaccinated fans should be banned. So if we're already talking about making vaccine passports mandatory in certain circumstances, it's easy to see how that could become a slippery slope where the government have access to other, not just even medical, we made this point before, it's a point of medical confidentiality, but also having access to your health and behaviour records in other contexts.
Political views, they can sort of like tap you and sort of, so where are we going with this?
Well, everybody knows what my political views are.
Why would I? Because you choose.
Why would the government want?
Because you choose to reveal them. You choose to. But
we've already got inquiries into political views. You have things called opinion polls. You have things called a canvass, and just about everybody in the whole of the country has been canvassed at some point. I just calm down, everybody. Calm down and focus on what is actually happening and what is important. And let me say right from the start, I think there are circumstances in which it is reasonable to require vaccination, care homes and hospitals being two of them.
So let's just have a quick look at some of the statistics here, because there was a survey done by the British Chamber of Commerce. They surveyed 1,000 firms, and they found that 31% of firms with more than 50 employees had suggested considering vaccine passports. So could you imagine, do you think it's possible that we could imagine a situation in which firms could, require evidence of your broader health rather than just
they do anyway. A lot of firms have medicals. A lot of firms make you do that anyway. Come on, let's stop inventing stuff.
But the thing is, in 2019, we were the UK, doing well, civil liberties, talking to each other. I mean, things were in the background, maybe going down a bit of a weird slope with sort of woke left stuff. But suddenly, 2020, we've become communist China.
Well,
we've become a complete different country.
We have a comment here from Maggie from Plymouth, who says, Boris is going to become the Prime Minister he always warned against. Do you think that this is, there have been lots of people who have been making this point, that you voted for a Conservative government and you've got a communist.
We haven't got a communist government, but he's incredibly weak. Mm-hmm. Incredibly weak, and I don't think that he stands up for actually what he believes in, which is free Britain. Do you remember him right at the beginning of this pandemic, right at the beginning, when advising people to stay at home? And television interviewers said, why don't you make it mandatory? Oh, this land of liberty. Well, where is the land of liberty now?
Where is the land of liberty? Exactly. And also, you could, I suppose, argue that this government is communitarian in it, but communitarian is just a polite word for communist.
No, it's not communist.
Well, but the thing is, vaccines...
Now, let's not make communitarian a dirty word.
Let's not make it a dirty word, even though Tony Blair was one. But anyway, the fact when you have a vaccine as well, you can still get the virus. So what's the point of having vaccine passports? Mm-hmm. Because that's literally like showing you've had a vaccine and then going, but I've also got COVID.
Vaccine passports, but not negative tests, and also come September, despite the fact that we've seen the most substantial decline in COVID cases without lockdown over the past week.
There's also been yesterday a study done that showed that the tests couldn't tell between COVID and flu. So lot of people that were in hospital,
we've been suspecting that for a long time,
actually had flu. Mm-hmm. So the numbers are completely wrong on this virus.
The fact that the numbers have been wrong has been evident for a while. I mean, the question is by how much are they wrong?
By how much? But and also how many other diseases, how many other coronaviruses, of which there are hundreds and hundreds in the human body, are we then going to shut down entire economies for? How many more?
It's worth pointing out that when you look at those statistics for the numbers of deaths from COVID, it clearly says underneath it, the government makes it very clear underneath it, deaths for any reason within 28 days of a positive COVID test. It says for any reason. Now, neither the BBC nor ITV ever read out for any reason. They always say deaths within 28 days of a positive. The implication being you've died of COVID. And we know that there is a complete muddle between dying of COVID, i.e. COVID caused your death, and dying with COVID. And you've come into hospital because, you've got some serious respiratory problem. Yeah. You test positive for COVID 3 days later. It doesn't actually follow that you've died of COVID.
Because you may almost certainly have got COVID in hospital.
Quite, and that
so I would say it's the hospitals and care homes. We need to be looking at what are they doing to minimise any transmission of viruses, whatever they may be.
That moves us very swiftly on to talking about NHS reform, because this leaked data in the last couple of days suggested that over half of COVID hospitalisations tested positive for COVID in hospital. So they were hospitalised first. So as you say, these are people who have died within 28 days of receiving a positive test, may have gotten that test in hospital. And so the discussions this morning have been all around whether or not this raises questions also about NHS reform, with Mike Graham on Talk Radio saying that the NHS is essentially analogue in a digital age, and that we should be discussing all of this, all of the stuff around NHS capacity, the fact that the beds are currently socially distanced and so on, and the fact that I think it was only one or two people in each hospital around the country. A very small proportion of beds are actually going to COVID patients.
Look, COVID apart. The NHS needs reform. It wasn't designed to cope with what we've got today. The founding fathers of the NHS made 3 completely incorrect assumptions. And the first and most crucial one was that because we had an NHS, we'd all get healthier, which we have. And that because we all got healthier, this is a crucial thing, demand would decline. So you've got a system based on declining demand, whereas in fact demand is going towards infinity. And that is because Bevan could not have foreseen, we're talking about the 1940s, he could not have foreseen the explosion of medical and surgical science, which was going to take off in the 60s and keep going ever since. And at its very simplest, before you had hip replacement surgery, you didn't have any queue for hip replacements. There was no demand because the thing that is demanded wasn't there. And therefore, it's gone into complete reverse. We don't tackle it because we're afraid of public opinion. When I say we, I mean politicians in general. All parties are afraid of public opinion on this one. And then very quickly, the other 2 errors were that longevity would stay roughly the same. Well, now we've got 16,000 centenarians and everybody takes it for granted you can get into your 90s. And the third was that national insurance would contribute a significant proportion of the cost of the NHS, which is now a joke. It's 80% of it comes from general taxation.
And of course a spike in population. As the population increases.
Did they presumably they didn't predict that by improving people's overall health they would therefore live longer and there would be more people?
Well, as I say, they didn't get long. They
were busy rebuilding, I suppose, the country after the Second World War. So there was all that as well, wasn't there? Sort of
they had a 1940s perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, in 1950, the average age of women was 69 years old. That is, you retired at 60, and you only got your pension for 9 years before you died. And people forget. Now, because we understand longevity, we think, oh, well, it must always have been obvious. It wasn't always obvious. It wasn't obvious.
Yes.
Simone from Surrey says people earning over £500,000 a year, presumably, should have to go private, freeing up the NHS for those who don't have the money.
Oh, I've said for a long time, those who can afford to pay, and I don't think you need to get to $500,000 before you can afford to pay, those who can afford to pay should. And that is why... until I could not get the vaccine because I was in the private sector. That is why I have not dealt with the NHS for about 40 years. I was in my 30s when I left the NHS and went to the private sector. I've recently had to re-register and fill in a 10-page form in order to get the vaccine because my private sector doctor wasn't allowed to feed me in at the appropriate time. I got it about 3 months after my age group.
And that's the other crazy thing, isn't it? Is that because I've had personal, very awful experiences with the NHS, but also the private sector. And what people, I can never understand why people don't want to tackle this, is that most of the NHS consultants work in the private sector. So in fact, really, they're just sort of the same thing. The other thing I was going to say is that this sacred cow would only be appropriate calling it a sacred cow, apart from the fact that the NHS is a cow with 3 legs, half an udder and 1 eye. And if that was a cow called Daisy and that was in my field, I'd say, sorry, Daisy, you know what? Your daisies are numbered. Move along. Sorry, I had to put that in. But in all seriousness, what the NHS is letting down the poorest in our society.
Badly.
This is what I cannot understand.
We've got a 2-tier system.
2-tier system.
Well, actually, we've got a 3-tier system.
Yeah, and you have people going to the NHS, going, I don't really understand what's happening. You have consultants who, frankly, are, in my experience, condescending beyond belief. So they don't understand what their illnesses are. They don't have people. We need to have a completely gut it. Completely gut our health system.
What we have to ask before we do any gutting is, if we were designing a health service now, knowing what we now know, what would we do? But even having asked that question, you then have to say, but you need to design something which can change.
Yes.
And for example, in 1998, when I was Shadow Health Secretary, and I was saying all of this then, in 1998, we need to ask ourselves that question. I was proposing workplace health schemes analogous to workplace pension schemes with similar reliefs. Now, of course, occupational pensions have died a death as far as final salary schemes go. And we have the gig economy, which means an awful lot of people are not in a workplace in that sense. Yeah. So that would have had to change. And our problem is we've got a system which was based on presumptions that no longer hold good. Yeah. And it can't change. We haven't got change built in.
And it's always bizarre to me that it's the left, whenever the right says this, the left always says, oh, but that's because, you just want to sort of get people to, pay all their money that they can't afford to a health service. And it's like, well, actually, no. This will change the lives, everyone's lives for the better. I've never understood that.
Why do you think the NHS has become this sacred cow? Why? What has led us to this situation where you can't question it, you can't even talk about it?
It's a political consequence. The Labour Party always say that the Conservatives either want to destroy the NHS or want to privatise the NHS or whatever it might be. And it's become something that the public is so scared of happening. Yeah. And as soon as you talk about insurance, they don't look at Germany, they don't look at France, they look at America. Yes. America, and say, we don't want to be like America. Yeah. And I say, I'm not asking you to be like America. Yeah. And it is a debate that we desperately need, a grown-up debate, because we've got a 3-tier health service. Yeah. On the top tier, you've got the people who get their NHS treatment or they choose to go private. Yes. On the next tier, you've got the people who don't get their NHS treatment because there's postcode prescribing or whatever it might be. They just, the queues are too long, they'd be dead by the end of it. And they don't choose to go private, but they can, sometimes at big sacrifice. Yes. And on the third tier, the very people for whom the NHS was set up in the first place, the people who don't get their NHS treatment, and if they starved themselves for a year, still couldn't afford to go private, they are dispossessed. And this system is being defended.
Yes, exactly. And the left still say, but let's keep it as it is. I mean, it's kind of bonkers. Not to mention the fact that the NHS during COVID has just sort of gone, let's just leave cancer.
Well, it stopped everything in order to deal with COVID.
And heart attacks to one side. I mean, it is. I mean, my late husband, God bless him, died of cancer at the end of 2018. I mean, I am apoplectic with rage, as I know people like Professor Carol Sikora, that cancer undiagnosed and late treatment has led to. I mean, the numbers are boggling, and we don't even know the full extent.
And something that no one is talking about is the fact that, and I know this from the horse's mouth, that cancer patients are getting pinged by the NHS app and not getting their chemotherapy as a result because they're having to stay at home and
not
isolate.
Good enough. I mean, why is nobody in the mainstream media holding the government to account in front of, in a camera?
Because it means criticising the NHS, and we mustn't do that, must we?
I mean, that must change.
We must do it.
To draw an analogy on the point of systems that were set up potentially to help people who need it and actually end up disadvantaging them because everybody else is taking up those services. The migrant crisis, because that's something that's been in the news this week with people who are coming over, economic migrants who are obviously taking up resources and spaces that could be given to genuine asylum seekers. It was reported this week in the Mail that record numbers of migrants have been coming over. Nigel Farage has been out there in a boat.
Looking very dishy, I have to say, with a kerchief.
Brexit suits him well.
He's sort of windswept. Nigel, I see you in a new light.
Anyway. And he's been reporting that the French vessels, as we all know, French military vessels have been escorting migrants into British waters rather than taking them back to French shores. And that we've had hundreds of boats coming in every day. These are people that are presumably economic migrants. And now, because the crisis is so bad, airport border staff have been redeployed from the airports at a time when, apparently, according to the Times, 1 in 10 people from the border force have been pinged and have to isolate because of the NHS app. So really, it's an absolute shambles on every possible level.
It's absurd.
So yes, what are your thoughts on what's going on? Is Priti Patel all talk? Do we need a similar reform of our immigration system to what you're discussing to do with the NHS?
There is only one way you get out of this. And I said this again, 1999, as Shadow Home Secretary then. Yeah. I said very clearly, the only way you get out of this, and there is a way out of it, is that every new asylum seeker must be detained in a secure reception centre, not a prison, but a secure reception centre, so that we know where they are, we can deal with their cases, and we can turn them around if we're going to say no. Now, what actually happens is the complete opposite. The message that's going out is if you get to Britain, if you can actually get into Britain, they're not going to be removed because we don't have national identity cards. We don't routinely practice detention. We do have a flourishing underground economy. And so it's the easiest place in the West, just about, in which to disappear without trace. So when we come to reject the application, where are they? Don't know where they are.
And we do continue also to pay, I think it's only a couple of pounds less in money to people whose applications get refused. So they're only really losing a couple of quid a month.
And also, there are a lot of people getting very rich, aren't they, from this people trafficking?
Companies like Serco as well.
The companies and they're not on the boats, of course. They're not on the boats.
Exactly, of course, they're not, risking their lives, in dinghies. Although the dinghies are getting a lot more, not just like little tiny dinghies. I mean, they're getting proper
hundreds of people
wooden
in some
boards.
Of these boats.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with Anne. That's the rational, compassionate way forward. I think now we need the army on the shores.
If you've got the army on the shores, I'm sorry, this is where we don't get it. If you've got the army on the shores, the boats still land.
Yes.
And they still say, I claim asylum. And they can still disappear.
Because they just have to get to the boats.
And where would
all they got to utter is 3 words. I claim asylum. That's all they got to do.
Sure. And where would the asylum, would these centres be sort of, on the shore? Or
Good
sort
heavens.
Of somewhere out?
We'd have to work out where to put them.
Yes.
I had a couple in mind at the time that I was Shadow Home Secretary. You take on existing structures.
Yes. Yeah.
And you use those. And it's perfectly possible to do. I know because at the time I looked at it in some detail.
Yeah.
But after me, Oliver Letwin, who then took over as Shadow Home Secretary, actually proposed, and that proposal has been revived by Priti Patel, that you could actually process them offshore.
Yes, that's what I was going to, like offshore wind farms.
Well, Mark
offshore migrant farms.
Mark from Middlesbrough.
You've got to find somebody willing to do it. That's the only thing.
Well, Mark from Middlesbrough agrees. He says, I agree with Anne. Why don't we process them on the Shetlands or one of the unpopulated British overseas territories, which is obviously something Priti Patel has suggested. He says maybe we can make them stay there. That would stop them coming.
Well,
it would certainly have a deterrent effect. It would certainly have a deterrent effect. And that is the idea. It is to deter. What you should not be doing, which is what Priti Patel is doing, is paying the French millions of pounds to do the thing that under their international obligations they should be doing anyway.
One argument is that we paid the French 20-odd million in October and now we're paying them another 50-odd million. Yeah. That by doing so, when they keep failing to do the job, we're just incentivising them to do the job badly because we'll keep paying them tens of millions of pounds if they keep messing it up.
They want to pass their problem on to us.
And also it's like, why did we leave Europe if we're still paying the French?
Yep.
To do their job.
It's absolutely ludicrous. I don't mind contributing to some joint efforts if they're genuinely joint efforts. This isn't. This is saying to the French, we'll pay you all this money to do something which you should be doing and which you're not going to do anyway.
Yeah. Ken from Penzance says, these aren't refugees, they're economic migrants. Most of them are young men who've left women and children behind. Deport them to the last country they left. Why can't we do that?
Easier said than done, and this is where you have to understand some of the problems. You get it particularly at the airports, for example. You get people turning up at the airports without documents and saying they've come from such and such a country where there is a record of persecution. Now, in order to return immigrants or anybody else for that matter, in order to return people to their country of origin, that country of origin under international law has to accept them as nationals. And they don't always do that, and sometimes it's quite... So it's easy to say, but the Dublin Convention says you have to claim asylum in the first safe country you come to. Well, if we know they've been through France, that was as safe as houses.
That was their... Yes, that's where they should stay. Yes, I agree.
So why is it that we can't just simply, when they reach our waters, put them on a boat, send them back to France?
Well, A, the will is not there. But B, France could very simply say, well, they didn't land here. They may have come through our waters, but they've come through, they've come somewhere else. Very difficult to prove, A, where they've been, B, where they came from. Yeah. And the genuine ones, of course, are young. They're very few and far between, but they're the ones who supply all the information because they are genuine refugees and you can test it. But
Yes.
we have people saying they're children when in fact they're quite visibly pensioners. It's true. You may laugh, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yes.
We have people saying they've come from Somalia and they can't speak a word of the language. You just...
Yeah.
I don't think anybody realises what it's like on the ground. That's why I say detain them all, because then what are they coming to? Detention.
Yes.
And if we're going to have a job proving that they're the national of a particular country, then they stay there.
And it sounds harsh, but it might be the only way to actually tell the difference between genuine
It's not
asylum
harsh
seekers
if you have proper secure facilities, which can cater for children where necessary.
Yes.
Cater for women, proper, decent facilities with education and all the rest of it. It's not harsh.
Yeah, it's just extraordinary to me, I suppose, that we've got to this stage, and I suppose it's because for successive governments have, yourself excluded, have
I wasn't in government.
well,
at
not
the
in
time
government,
of
but I mean, I should say politicians then have just sort of gone shrug their shoulders. Said if it's going to be, it's going to be. Well, there are people coming to this country who don't like the West very much, don't like our values and Judeo-Christian traditions. That's where I'm appalled that very few people have said enough. I mean, this has been happening, isn't it, for like 20 odd years?
And you get a lot of talk. I mean, Pretty is a very good example of somebody who talks very big indeed and delivers precious little. And that 54 million that we've just paid France, we could have put towards constructing reception centres.
Yeah,
would have been far more useful.
Practical pragmatism.
Far more useful.
Yeah.
So something else that has been in the news this week, quite horrifying, a lady called Hatton Tash, a 39-year-old lady at Speaker's Corner, she appears to have been stabbed in the face, and there's a horrendous video of it. And this lady, she's a convert from Christianity to Islam. She preaches at Speaker's Corner regularly.
From Islam to Christianity?
No, other way.
Oh, other way. Yes,
from Islam to Christianity.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, sorry, did I say it the wrong way
Yeah.
around? And so she preaches there regularly. She's previously had threats against her as well. The Metropolitan Police had to ferry her away at one point because there were threats against her life. And at the time, Sadiq Khan made a strange, equivocating statement where he said that he thought that the police had to balance the right to free speech with the right of the police to manage behaviour that could lead to public disorder. So rather than criticising those who...
This is Speaker's Corner.
Yeah.
Speaker's Corner has never yet been charged with breach of the peace.
No.
And you must have statements likely to cause a breach of the peace every day in Speaker's Corner, because that's what it's for.
Yes,
that's what it's about.
Exactly.
It's about people being able to say anything.
Yes.
But I wouldn't read too much into that attack. That is a lone attack. Oh yes, it happened. We mustn't get things out of proportion. That was an attack by an individual on an individual, and unless the police can show otherwise, it's got to be treated that way.
So she was one of the other points is that she was wearing a Charlie Hebdo t-shirt.
Yeah.
And we obviously know what has happened previously with the teacher in Batley and with Samuel Paty in
Still in
France.
hiding.
And given that she'd already received threats, and actually the Free Speech Union had written to the Met asking for her to receive proper protection because she'd been threatened before. And there's a video also from the same day that was going around on social media with some people in a group near Speaker's Corner saying that she had it coming. So it looks as if it isn't just some sort of like freak out. They just targeted her and decided to sort of stab her in the face. And I think, as far as I'm aware, the police haven't arrested anyone yet. This person just ran away.
See, again, we've given extremists in Islam, we've given them an inch, and now they've taken the whole cowshed. I don't know if that's offensive. I don't really care. It's unacceptable in this country for somebody at Speaker's Corner to be wearing a t-shirt of a magazine where 12 individuals were murdered by Islamists. For the press to be silent about it is even more worrying. And what's happened is we've done this, which is ironically a bit of a French gesture. We've kind of gone, that's why we're getting, and it hasn't just, this isn't an isolated incident. This is going to happen again and again and again if we keep apologising for this kind of behaviour, whether it's woke left, sort of stopping people saying things, or whether it's somebody with a knife
Well,
stabbing a woman at Speaker's Corner.
Joanna Williams tweeted earlier this week saying that this was the armed wing of cancel culture or something to that effect.
I just think we need to be careful. I mean, if you think of the murder of Joe Cox, it was very much portrayed as this is the result of, right-wing activism, etc. It wasn't. It was one man who held those views who did that.
Yes.
And when it happens on the other side, we must also allow for exactly that same possibility. Now, if the police can find the man and he has been radicalised, then that is different. And then you've got to trace the radicaliser.
But with Joe Cox, I would argue, though, that there aren't men like the man that committed that crime against Joe Cox. That there's not That's not systemic. I would argue that the crime against this woman at Speaker's Corner is part of a systemic problem within Islam, within one religion. And what they want, because they haven't been through an enlightenment, and I know there are many Muslim scholars that would say the same thing, because they haven't been through the enlightenment like Christianity. Judaism, of course, and Judaism. That is why we are where we are, because we're dealing with people that don't understand. No. This is not the country. If you want to do those, by all means, go to a country that will execute you if you blaspheme. That's not the United Kingdom. And we all need to say, no, enough.
I wonder whether, obviously, we've seen recently that there are lots of people who are willing to, for example, commit criminal damage or other acts of violence, not just in relation to what you would say maybe like blasphemies against any particular religion, but also blasphemies against certain taboos, certain either spoken taboos or in alignment with wokeism, however you want to describe it. Because earlier today I saw on Twitter there was a clip from a lecture given at LSC. It was someone from the Department for Gender Studies, a student presented a paper at a conference. And I'm going to read out the quote to see what you think of it. So this student said, and it said so in quite a poetic way, I'm not going to manage to capture that, said, we go unnoticed right up until the moment they scream for mercy. Am I a threat to you? Do I send chills down your spine? Picture this, I hold a knife to your throat and spit my transness into your ear. Does that turn you on? Are you scared? I sure effing hope so. And according to this tweet, this was obviously in the context of talking about TERFs. So I guess my question to you is, obviously we know all of the context around Hatton Tash and Charlie Hebdo. It's something that's been going on for a long time, all the way from Salman Rushdie, Theo van Gogh, so many different cases, and the Charlie Hebdo satirical cartoonists themselves being gunned down in 2015. We know the context of that. We know that, Islamists want to physically harm people who blaspheme against their ideology. But my question to you is more, are we seeing a sort of worrying drift towards an intolerance against other taboos as well, or other people who hold other views? How concerned should we be about, potential violence against, say, TERFs?
Very. Now, I don't think that necessarily exemplifies it, because I haven't seen the whole paper. I don't know in what context those particular lines appeared. It was a paper from a student. It isn't as if this is, a sanctioned university course or whatever it might. So I just want to be very careful about drawing from that. But I think, should we be worried about violence towards people whose views are deemed unacceptable to the wokerati? I think the answer is yes, because I think that's the path we're now going down. Yeah. It began with social condemnation, then it went to cancellation, where your actual livelihood can be under threat. Yeah. The next stage is probably some sort of violence. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who holds woke views would approve of that, but everybody doesn't have to. It will be sufficient if some do.
Yes, exactly. And also these TERFs. I mean, I've been called a TERF. For a start, I'm not trans-exclusionary, and I'm not a radical feminist. so it's sort of like...
So it's all wrong, isn't it?
So it's all wrong. It's no, I believe there are two biological sexes. I'm an adult human female. That's my I'm happy to be white, that's who I am. But I don't. It's this grouping together of people, even if it's inaccurate. That's the funny thing. Is like, I'm not gender critical. I do believe that there are within men and women, and they've done experiment, obviously with chimps, baby chimps, that a male chimp will go for the building blocks and a female tiny baby chimp will go for dolls. I mean, they've done many experiments where that is sort of, your behaviour is sort of aligned with your gender. So that's another thing but again, the left love to sort of put people into groups without looking at individual views. They just sort of go, well, that's you then.
So to wind up briefly, I also wanted to put to you some statistics from a poll that was published in The Spectator through Steerpike. Apparently, 40% of the public would support the government censoring books with content that is sexist, homophobic or racist. So they surveyed...
According to whose definition?
Yeah. And 29% said that they don't know whether they would agree with that. And so some of the other stats here, 62% said that they would support social media companies censoring similar content. 57% said that Ofcom should have greater powers to fine broadcasters who make offensive comments. And 51% said that they agreed that the government should stay neutral in societal debates on cultural issues like taking the knee. So my question is twofold. Firstly, has the Conservative government on these cultural issues misjudged the mood of the public, if this poll is correct? And also, given what we were just talking about in terms of the growing intolerance towards particular views, particular taboos, does this suggest that actually the British public would be more tolerant of the government taking a role in censoring those views than perhaps we thought?
Well, I think if I've read that poll correctly, first of all, this is not a poll of just young people. This is a poll right across the generations. And something like 40% think it would be okay for the government to act as censors on things like racism and homophobia and all the rest. Now, according to whose definition is not entirely clear. Now, we've already got a situation in which you don't even have to objectively prove that an offence has taken place. Somebody can claim that an offence has taken place, and that is enough to have you with a police record. I mean, not a criminal record, you haven't been convicted anywhere, but it's enough to have you on some police register. Now, it's getting dangerous. It's getting dangerous, and yes, there is a pushback. We've got GB News. We've got Free Speech Union. We've got a pushback going on. But oh boy, has it now got something to push back against. Totally and maybe we should have had this pushback 10 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. We're seeing, I mean, the fact that we're almost certainly going to have free speech legislation, which I very much back, by the way, is an interesting indicator because of course we have an unwritten constitution. So we have a social contract with each other that we've had, which has worked very well is the envy of most of the world. Now we're seeing the idea that the government are going to be more, are going to sort of interfere more in our lives, which I will push back against with every breath that's left in my body. I'm not going to have, what's going down
just
that path.
Final thoughts. Do you think that this trajectory towards, and I don't just mean on free speech, but also when we were talking about the vaccine passports and so on, do you think that we are hurtling towards a culture, both in terms of the relationship between the individual and the government, but also people's views in general, the government's views also, hurtling towards worrying restrictions on our liberty? And do you think that that's reversible?
It is reversible, but it's not going to be reversible overnight. It will need more than just legislation. It will need sheer social unacceptability directed towards intolerance. And until we have that, which we once had and took utterly for granted, I mean, where did it go? Were we not alert when it was going?
Completely agree. And we need to be intolerant of intolerance. Absolutely. None of this sort of like, well, we might allow that. No. We won't allow that, because you give them a little tiny bit and then all of a sudden, we're all riding bicycles, wearing Maoist uniforms.
On that note...
Well, wearing masks, certainly, wearing masks. Yeah.
On that note, thank you, Anne, thank you, Abi, and thank you for watching as well. So please do go on, hit the subscribe button and like, and see you next time. Thanks very much.
Or dislike. We believe in free speech.
Not sure there is a dislike button.